For over 100 years, it has been heralding the end of winter across Tampa Bay, with the crack of the bat, the pop of a ball in a freshly oiled mitt, and a belief shared by all fans that this is going to be the year. But over a century ago, long before spring training becomes as synonymous with this area as tourists and white sand beaches, the idea of big league teams coming here to prepare for the season is little more than a dream.
Everybody who came here into Tampa Bay, from the Spanish to the British, from that point forward, saw Tampa Bay as an incredible, safe, deep water port that could rival Charleston, Savannah, and is much closer to New Orleans than the Mississippi River. So in those early days, before William Straub convinced everybody that we could have this incredible downtown waterfront, you looked at a lot of shipping, a lot of fishing type businesses, boat repairs, those type of things.
The train system, which really essentially built up the city of St. Pete, didn't arrive until 1888. So we've only got really about 20 years after this. The city only had about 10,000 folks here. They're hard scrabble a lot, without a question, but now the city's starting to welcome tourism. Tourism is the key factor. It's the sand, it's the sun, it's the surf, without a question.
It was an unusual city, though, by any standard. It was a southern city, but not a typical southern city. St. Petersburg was already acquiring a reputation as a place where Northerners, especially Midwesterners, would come rest their cold bones in the winter.
So many folks from Northern Enterprises that have been instructed by their doctors to leave the northern environs and come down to St. Petersburg for their health. And plenty of accounts run about folks saying, oh, my doctor said I only had 6 months to live, and then 60 years later, they pass away in the city of St. Petersburg after being here for those decades.
There may not be a better example of that than Al Lang. Just shy of his 40th birthday, the Pittsburgh native and businessman is suffering from respiratory problems, a condition serious enough that his doctor tells him it's terminal.
It's unclear what his respiratory affliction was, but the prescription for it was clean air, anything but Pittsburgh air. So he came to St. Petersburg, and he felt that, as his health improved, that the only thing this city was lacking was baseball.
Al Lang was a native Pittsburgher who came to St. Petersburg for his health, mayor of St. Petersburg. He knew the owner of the Pittsburgh Pirates, Barney Dreyfuss. And Dreyfuss just scoffed at the idea that the Pirates would train in St. Petersburg.
He asked his old friend Barney Dreyfuss, who owned the Pirates, and Dreyfuss told him that, you must be crazy if you think I'm coming to that one-tank town.
At the same time, just across the bay, the bigger and more well-established city of Tampa also has designs on bringing a big league team farther south than ever before for spring training. And in 1913, Tampa Mayor D.B. McKay manages to outmaneuver Lang on the heels of his rejection by the Pirates.
McKay lures the Chicago Cubs in the coming year. They promise room, board, and expenses for 35 players. That's huge, beating St. Petersburg, but more importantly, securing a team. And the Chicago Cubs were a pretty good team at that time.
After his initial efforts to lure his hometown Pittsburgh Pirates go nowhere, Lang turns his attention to an also-ran American League team from St. Louis.
The Browns, the famous nickname was first in shoes, first in booze, last in the American League. They were a woeful team, one of the worst teams in baseball history. But they had a colorful player, manager, vice president by the name of Branch Rickey in 1914. So Rickey brings his team to St. Petersburg.
The city invested a lot of money in that trip. They built a facility on Coffee Pot Bayou. They paid for the Browns to come. They paid for the Browns front office to come. And here's the key. They paid for 5 St. Louis sports writers to come because Lang understood that having a spring training here was going to be ultimately meaningless to the growth of the city if the people outside the city, in the places where the winters were cold, didn't know that it was here.
The city built new streetcars to bring people. They built a pier at Coffee Pot Bayou so steamboats could come there. I mean, the afternoon, all the businesses closed. I think the Times said this is the first time in the city history that baseball has shut the city down.
Not only did it kick off spring training coming to St. Petersburg, and he's known as kind of like the father of baseball in Florida, so he brought it here to stay. A lot of people didn't think he'd be able to pull it off, and he did. And it just opened the floodgates for Major League Baseball to come to Florida.
Ambassador of baseball, the godfather of spring training, whatever moniker you want to give him, without a question. Al Lang recognized the importance of baseball as a whole, as a sport, as a community gathering device, but recognized that bringing in northern teams into St. Petersburg to practice, to train, would open up the exposure of the Sunshine City and encourage more folks actually to come here. Again, selling St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg's first ever spring training game on February 27, 1914, is, by all accounts, a huge success. Even though the Browns don't come back the following year, Lang and the city find an even better replacement.
The Browns were here, the Phillies came, the Phillies won a National League pennant in the year that they trained here, and they credited their pennant to the beautiful weather that they had had in St. Petersburg for camp. It was as if Al Lang had written the copy.
You've got a sense of pride and sense of energy that the city is booming. The city is coming about within just 5-6 years after this pivotal moment of 1914 and the arrival of spring training. We've got this boom going on. Hotels start sprouting up throughout the city. A couple glorious examples still remain to this day, such as the Vinoy Hotel and then the Don Cesar over on Paso Grill. These are just 2 beautiful examples of that, of the wealth and the opulence that's coming into the area.
Buoyed by their achievements and the rapid growth of the Sunshine City, Lang and Company upped the ante by building a brand new facility right on the edge of Tampa Bay. The Boston Braves are the first team to call Waterfront Park home. But it's the arrival of the New York Yankees in 1925 that solidifies St. Pete's standing as the epicenter of spring training.
The public fascination with the New York Yankees is hard to imagine today. I mean, everyone knew who Babe Ruth was, who Lou Gehrig was. Later, when DiMaggio joins the team in the late 30s, it's a dynasty.
Wherever Babe Ruth came, it was like a presidential entourage of reporters. That he was the first guy that newspapers paid their own money to cover. That, prior to Babe Ruth, the ball clubs picked up the tabs for the traveling reporters. For Babe Ruth, his story was so big that newspapers assigned reporters specifically just to cover Babe Ruth.
This is a time when tourists come. So if you're from New York and you're a tourist, you join the New York Club. And on the holidays, they would march behind the New York banner. The managers and coaches and players buy real estate. They buy bowling alleys and bars or homes in the area. So it's not just a flirtation. This is kind of a love affair consummated in commerce.
When Al Lang started this whole venture, St. Petersburg was the tiny little one-tank town, in Barney Dreyfus's words. By the time the Yankees came a decade later, the second team, the first city to have 2 teams, St. Petersburg was a city name that everybody in America knew, that it was one of those iconic Florida brand names: Key West, Miami, Palm Beach, St. Augustine, St. Petersburg.
As if that newfound recognition wasn't enough, the city reaches new heights when it replaces the Braves with the St. Louis Cardinals in 1938, giving it 2 of the game's premier franchises. The outbreak of World War II and government-imposed travel restrictions will temporarily derail St. Pete's spring training success story. But in its own way, the big one sets up the region's next big boom.
Obviously, the tourist industry brought in lots of dollars, lots of folks, so the city was actually wise enough and smart enough to contact and get a hold of the Department of Defense and offer all of our essentially empty hotel rooms, the hundreds if not thousands of hotel rooms available, which are now sitting idle and empty because of the Depression and because of the outbreak of World War II. So now by 42, 43, you've got well over 100,000 troops training here in St. Petersburg.
Most importantly though, hundreds of thousands of servicemen and their sweethearts had seen Florida for the first time. It seemed like every GI wanted to return to Florida someday.
With the war over and the country looking to get back to normal, spring training seems to take on new meaning.
It is almost a validation of why we fought. I mean, the boys are home, the economy is booming. Baseball had been severely curtailed during the war. DiMaggio and Hank Greenberg and hundreds of others go off to war. And so in 46, it's peacetime, it's prosperity, and it's springtime Florida. I mean, it's perfect harmony.
Throughout the first half of the 20th century, spring training continues to thrive across the region. In Tampa, Plant Field is home to the Washington Senators throughout the 20s, and then the Cincinnati Reds beginning in 1930, while Clearwater starts its decades-long run with the Phillies in 1947. But it's St. Pete, with a new waterfront stadium named after its former mayor and ambassador of baseball, and its two marquee franchises, that continues to capture the attention of tourists and locals alike well into the 50s.
Whitey Ford, Mickey, and the Marises, and the Bears, and Elston Howard, and Hank Scourins, and Bobby Richardson, and Kubek, and Clete Boyer. I mean, it's like it was yesterday. It's still in my mind.
The Yankees, you went from Ruth to Gehrig to DiMaggio to Mantle, and you went from Miller Huggins to Joe McCarthy to Casey Stengel. Storytellers' dreams, all. Same thing with the Cardinals. You had the Gas House Gang, Dizzy Dean, Frankie Frisch, the pennant winners of the 1930s. Then you had the teams of the 1940s and 50s, the Stan Musial teams, and then the teams of the 1960s, which were anchored by Bob Gibson, Bill White, Kurt Flood, African-American players that obviously also play largely into the history of St. Petersburg spring training.
The Dodgers and Jackie Robinson famously break Major League Baseball's color barrier in 1947. But more than a decade later, African-American players are still dealing with a deeply entrenched system of segregation when they come to Florida for spring training. In late 1960, a series of events starting with local civil rights sit-ins helped to shatter those racial barriers.
In 1961, Wendell Smith, who was a crusading African-American journalist, very close to Jackie Robinson, wrote a number of articles in the Chicago American saying that the time has come to end the segregation of Major League spring training, that the African-American players, needed to live with their teammates.
Around the same time, two prominent local civil rights activists, Dr. Ralph Wimbish and Dr. Robert Swain, announced they're no longer going to help the Yankees and Cardinals find housing for their African-American players.
For years, we've been sort of complicit in this system of segregation in the downtown hotels and the restaurants. The black ball players have come in, and we've either put them in our houses or we've found places for them in the black community in boarding houses. And we're just not going to do it anymore. It's just disgraceful in 1961.
It wasn't a move that was accepted wholeheartedly through the African-American community. It was a huge revenue source, but you have to get back to the root issue. Why was it necessary for those established ball players to be living separate from the white counterparts?
It's not just the issue of segregated hotels that come under attack in '61. Cardinals first baseman Bill White also decides to publicly take a stand over the annual Salute to Baseball breakfast at the St. Pete Yacht Club to welcome the Cardinals and Yankees.
All the people on the invitation list were white. None of the black players had been invited. Now, the Chamber of Commerce later said, oh, it was just an oversight, it's just a mistake, we didn't mean to do that, but obviously they did. And something just snapped in Bill White. He said, you know, I just can't stand this. This is just demeaning, degrading. And so he did a couple of newspaper interviews.
It went out on the UPI wire. Newspapers all over the country carried it, that, you know, the mayor told the yacht club that we are going to integrate this breakfast.
And Elston Howard goes. He's ordered by Dan Topping, you've got to go to this breakfast. Bill White says, forget it, I'm not going. They didn't really invite me. They don't really want me there. He's really taking a chance here when he doesn't go to that breakfast. But I think he senses that history's on his side, really, here at this point.
All of a sudden now, the Yankees and the Cardinals are in a dilemma because you've got reporters asking, what are you going to do? What are you going to do with your African American ball players? They're very important to your team. How are you going to house them? Because you can't house them in the hotels. And they said, well, we're going to make an effort.
Desegregating the hotels would prove to be a much more complicated issue, at least in part, because the Yankees are considering leaving St. Pete.
The Yankees were still at the top, and they're actually going to go on, of course, and win the World Series in '61. That this is the year of Roger Maris and Mickey Mantle, the extraordinary year with all the home runs, and they're going to beat the Reds, actually, who trained in Tampa 4-1 in the World Series. So when anything that happens to the Yankees is a huge deal. They had already been thinking about leaving St. Pete, actually, for several years. Later, there's going to be much more competition between the towns when spring training becomes big money. But this was an early version of this. Fort Lauderdale had been trying to kind of recruit or seduce the Yankees into moving. The Yankees wanted to leave anyway, and in some ways this crisis over race and over segregation gave them an excuse.
1961 was the Yankees' last spring training here. Their hotel refused to integrate, and they had to house their African American players separately that year. And then the next year they left for Fort Lauderdale. That had been in the works long before that. Fort Lauderdale was building a brand new facility for them, and there was just an inevitability about that move.
At the end of 1961, with no clear resolution to desegregating St. Petersburg's hotels, the Yankees end their 37-year relationship with the city, making efforts to keep the Cardinals even more critical.
There's a pattern throughout the Jim Crow South that when it hurts business, that's when businessmen step up and they say, you know, we don't really care that much about whether things are segregated. There was a move back in St. Louis to boycott Busch beer. And that's really, I think, more than anything else, what motivates the Cardinal hierarchy to, well, we got to do something here. I mean, if we don't sell beer, we're in big trouble.
With pressure mounting in the spring of '62, the Cardinals make sure they'll be able to house their entire team under one roof.
They decide to buy their own motel. So they buy the Outrigger Motel out at the beach, and they move all of the players out there, and they can control it. And so, as Bill White says in his memoir, it was really quite wonderful. You know, the players got to know each other in a way that they hadn't before, and their families can be there, and it's just a dramatic shift for him and the other black players, and I think it becomes a model for the other teams as well.
By 1964, spring training was fully integrated. You know, you look at it and you say, well, of course, it was inevitable. But then you look at the timing of it. You look at where we were in the civil rights movement in 1961. That was before the Freedom Rides, before the voter registration, before Birmingham, before Selma. That this was really sort of, in a lot of ways, as profound a moment in the overall civil rights movement as Jackie Robinson's integration of the game in 1947.
They were up against a closed system, but But it took someone like Bill White and the courage of Ralph Wimbish and Robert Swain to sort of put cracks in the mold, and that's what happens in 1961. And the city and the Tampa Bay area has never been the same since. In some ways, it's sort of the beginning of the modern metropolitan area that obviously is not perfect, but is a radically different place than what it was prior to 1961.
Why stop with spring baseball when we have further issues that need to be addressed? There's a whole section or many sections of the city that African Americans weren't privy to based off of those Jim Crow laws and the color line. So those decisions helped move us forward to equality in many different ways. So I'm very proud of that.
The city manages to keep the Cardinals for another 4 decades, but there is a big hole left by the departure of the Yankees. It doesn't take long for St. Pete to find a replacement, though. The expansion New York Mets, led by former Yankees manager Casey Stengel, come to the Sunshine City in the spring of 1962. It's another long-term relationship that lasts until the late 80s. On the surface, today's spring training looks very different than it did over a century ago. But at its core, the ritual of players and fans making their annual migration south to escape the snow and cold seems to be frozen in time. A permanent part of Tampa Bay baseball history.
Spring training is the most wonderful thing in the world because you see the young players trying to make it. You see a lot of the veterans that have already made it, but they're at ease here. And you can get a little closer to them than you can in a regular game. And the weather's gorgeous. I mean, it's just made this area.
I used to sell the Evening Independent, which was the afternoon paper at the time, outside the open-air post office and outside Moss Brothers downtown, and spring training was always just a crazy time in St. Petersburg. For that 1 month, it was just a nonstop party.
To be able to watch baseball in the middle of the winter, that it doesn't matter where you are, what stadium you are in, there's that magic to spring training. That spring training is its own reward.
Every American kid dreamt of spring training. As a kid in the St. Louis area in the 50s, the names Sarasota, Clearwater, Lakeland, St. Petersburg just seemed so exotic to me. I mean, my God, to be in Florida in February, are you kidding me? How good is that?